Meanwhile, South Africa expects to increase trade with BRICS partners China, Brazil, Russia and India. Last year, over 17% of South Africa's exports were destined for other BRICS nations, whilst over 29% of our total imports came from these countries. Total South African trade with BRICS countries reached 702 billion rand in 2021, and that's up from 487 billion in 2017. For a little bit more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Dr. Martyn Davies, who's the Managing Director of Emerging Markets and Africa at Deloitte Africa. Thank you so much, Dr. Martyn Davies, for joining us. Welcome to the program. Always good to talk to you.
Thanks, Peter. Always good to chat to you, Peter. How are you today?
Not too bad. So there's the usual agenda about strengthening ties and developing business, but I guess this comes under a cloud of Russia-Ukraine, because if there's one conflict that's really touched the whole world and all these BRICS nations, has been this conflict, I guess this will have to be discussed.
Undoubtedly, yes. I mean, if we're looking at through that lens particularly, I mean, the Russian invasion, I'll call it what you will, but invasion of Ukraine in late Feb has had dramatic implications, particularly for Africa. I think food supply, food security, food inflation, and all these very, very bad things for the continent, not to mention spiking energy prices and the like, which South African consumers, all of us, when we go to the fuel stations, we certainly bear the brunt of. So, these are the foremost real geoeconomic issues that are hitting home very hard, that our government should be raising in this session. And what will Russia in particular be doing to alleviate supply blockages and to allow increased exports from Ukrainian ports, and to encourage the exports of wheat onto the global markets. I think, however, the other thing really is something which we kind of oblivious to, is in this BRICS summit and all BRICS summits, in fact, neighboring great powers will always have issues that other countries are maybe oblivious to. I'm referring particularly here to India, China, territorial disputes, China, Russia, Russia, India. So all of these issues are quite sort of, certainly reading the Indian media today, they have a very different take on BRICS and the meeting of BRICS from what we do. For example, in South Africa, we always talk, as you say, Peter, about trade and geopolitical issues and very much Western alignment and the like. For India, it's all about sort of great power rivalry with China and how that plays out. But of course, you're right in saying that this BRICS summit is all, the spotlight, I would argue, as you allude to, is certainly on Russia.
But what conversations can actually come out of this? China's really gone out of its way to help Russia, increasing imports of its gas and oil and things like that. Can India and Brazil come to the party for its BRICS partner? And what can South Africa do? Because we seem to be more a victim than anything else.
Very true. We're certainly a price taker. More accurately, I was looking at some stats earlier today. The imports Chinese imports of Russian products, i.e. oil and gas, has surged dramatically over the course of the last 6 weeks or so. Incredible increase. So, and also in India's case, these countries, we saw the UK government a week or so ago, Foreign Secretary of the UK, Liz Truss, visiting India, sort of lobbying India to sort of comply almost to a line of Western sanctions vis-a-vis Russia. The Indians aren't doing it. India, China are certainly importing cheaper energy prices, oil and gas, into their own economies. And they would argue this is enhanced energy security for their respective populations, over 1 billion people each. And that's a very valid argument. In South Africa's case, and maybe with Brazil the same, we're more sort of, on the bearing the brunt of this. And certainly I don't see any upside here at all. South Africa's been very, how should we say, putting it politely, constructive, silent diplomacy vis-a-vis this whole crisis and conflict. I just hope that behind the scenes in these meetings and leading up to this summit later this week on the 24th with President Ramaphosa, that our government is necessarily assertive vis-a-vis these issues and speaking about African issues, which clearly were not foreseen by Moscow prior to the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah. Talking about African issues, I mean, I just look at neighboring Zimbabwe. Inflation there was 60% before the Russian invasion, shooting up to 131%. Cyril Ramaphosa can't just be representing South Africa in this conversation.
No, it stretches from top to the bottom of the continent. And what I'm surprised by, maybe I'm not surprised to be surprised, is that where's the position from the African Union on this? It's not just our own sub-region that is being affected. Egypt, for example, recent IMF intervention. Egypt is practically imports almost all its wheat and grain out of Russia, out of Ukraine, and has sought IMF support in a space of a couple of weeks post the conflict and the disruption of a supply chain. So really, as this is for many countries across the continent, even West Africa, being dramatically affected, this is food security. The Economist magazine covered this very accurately a week or two ago, talking about sort of the threat of famine in large parts of the continent because of this obstruction to the supply chain that has happened. So I really hope that our government realizes this. I hope the AU realizes this, and this is a perfect time to raise these issues and saying, well, okay, fine, this is the arguably the unintended consequence of this conflict. Now, how do we solve it? And what is we as BRICS countries are going to do to solve it in the shortest possible time? Because the livelihoods of Africans and food security is at stake, and that's where I'm saying we need to have a very coherent, a very pan-African, forget about the ideology and the liberation and old political relations here. This is about food security, and that's immediate. This isn't about history. So we certainly need to address these issues quite assertively, I would argue.
You talk about supply chain disruption. Is there anything that Russia can do to ease the pain? We hear about Ukraine complaining about blockades, and the US even accusing Russia of stealing grain from Ukraine to sell on to Africa.
There's two very different narratives here, Peter, of course, and the truth always lies between the two. There's a Moscow narrative, and there's one here which is more sort of Western, you could argue. I do think that the obstruction of exports is certainly real in many cases, and this could be alleviated. And I think we need to start to sort of seek those solutions as soon as possible. They've not really been forthcoming up until now. And as I mentioned, there's many. I did an exercise a few weeks ago looking at sort of the trade dependency or the vulnerability of sort of food supply of exports from Ukraine into certain African countries. Quite an array of countries, and none of us knew this. Seemingly, we're kind of oblivious to the vulnerability of the supply of food, particularly out of Ukraine and certain parts of Russia, up until February 24th, when the conflict started. And we've all been pretty shocked at this dramatic impact, some countries more than others. And again, as you allude to, Peter, is that, we're finding inflation as a mega trend of our time. In Africa, it's fueled, excuse the pun, fueled by or exacerbated by very poor infrastructure. Inflation doesn't seem to be affecting East Asia anywhere near to the same extent for a multitude of reasons. But you mentioned Zimbabwe as a case, and many others. These are countries that are already prone to inflation, and a shock that has happened in recent weeks certainly amplifies the impact and certain negative impact on people's lives, and that's not right, and that needs to be solved.
Sometimes these groupings, when things are going well, it's easy to say that they're fantastic and this is why we set them up, but I guess a true test is how these groupings can help manage crisis and difficult moments. Could this be a real test of BRICS?
Yes, particularly considering one of its main members here, Russia, is in the spotlight, as we both agree. I think the BRICS plus other developing countries, which is what it's becoming, is trying to morph into some sort of geopolitical counterweight to the G20, which is more of a Western construct. So this is ultimately about geopolitics, and it's all about perception and power and who's in the room, and and power is constantly, the perception of power, measurement of power is always in flux. But we want BRICS to deal with real issues. The most substantive result of BRICS has been a new development bank, which is an amazing creation. In a very short period of time, it's become well institutionalized and funding some great infrastructure projects, mostly renewable energy across the continent, and that's doing a great job. And it has come about, the institutions being created from a geopolitical grouping of countries, but at the same time is deploying capital in a non-political, depoliticized manner, and that's an incredible positive. The BRICS countries will be talking about rating agencies, trying to sort of, talking about US, the Chinese have always been pushing this, the Russians will certainly back it now increasingly, is moving away from dollar-denominated trade because of the vulnerability, depends on the US dollar. The South Africans will follow along with that, currency swap arrangements with renminbi-denominated trade rather than US dollar, and trying to create some sort of alternative construct to the global economy that has clearly been the rules the Chinese will always tell you were written when they were not a player. And the BRICS has become, again, they're trying to change the rules of the game, if you will. And China certainly has the influence to do that. Russia will try. South Africa will spectate. But as will Brazil, but certainly we need to really shape these conversations, or firstly define, and secondly shape what is the interest that we require, what is our interest as African countries, or at the very least our region in southern Central Africa, should we say. How do we define the interest, and how do we come up with our own policy agendas, rather than just following those from Beijing and Moscow, particularly Moscow this week.
Dr. Martyn Davies, we're going to have to leave it there. These are interesting times. Let's see what happens at this summit. Thanks for your time.